after the Iliad, there were several narratives in ancient Greece that were considered to be kind of offshoots of the Iliad, sequels, if you wish, okay? And the Odyssey is one of them. So let's deal with one or two others before we get to the Odyssey, just to compare with them and to point out how more simple they are compared to the Odyssey, all right? By far the most important and popular and well-known sequel to the Iliad, other than the Odyssey, is called the Agamemnon, which is the name of a Greek tragedy that was composed about 200 years after Homer in the 5th century BC, okay? So it's called the Agamemnon for the obvious reason that that dude that we talked about, the king of kings, the guy, Menelaus' brother, the king of Mycenae, the guy who got to be considered by all but Achilles to be the leader of the Greeks going over to Troy to fight the Trojan War, he had a homecoming just like Odysseus did. So that's the main thread that goes throughout the different sequels of the Iliad, is the idea of homecoming. The idea of the Trojan War is over, the Trojans, almost all of them to a man, were killed by the Greeks, and then the women were put into slavery. So the dudes were killed, and then women and children were forced into slavery. And so, as you could probably guess, I mean, since Homer was so important to the ancient Greeks, the aftermath of the Trojan War was also extremely important. It had a lot of resonance in literature following the epic poetry of Homer. You would probably guess that in Greek tragedy, one of the main themes that Greek tragedians adopted was the aftermath of the Trojan War and what happened mainly to the Trojans, okay, to the Trojan women in particular. Okay, there's a really famous and important tragedy called The Trojan Women by the third of the three great tragedians. Agamemnon, remember, the king of kings that had the big fight with Achilles after the Trojan War, after the Greeks win the Trojan War unequivocally, and pretty much all the Trojans are killed. Agamemnon tries to get home, and he does pretty quickly. Okay, so he sails away from Troy to get back home to Mycenae, and he does. And waiting for him there at home, his wife, Clytemnestra, is waiting for him to get back home, and he does. And she lays out, to add insult to injury, a red carpet for him to walk onto the stoop to their palace, symbolizing what's about to come, or foreshadowing it. Okay, and so once he gets into the palace, Clytemnestra and her boyfriend Aegisthus ice Agamemnon, kill him. Why? Big time reason, and it connects to the Trojan War. Before the Trojan War, when the Greeks decided, because of Menelaus and Agamemnon, to seek revenge against the Trojans for kidnapping Helen, or, you know, with quotes around kidnapping, because she kind of went voluntarily, according to some. The only way for the Greeks to be able to make it to Troy, to sail to Troy, was to sacrifice Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, to the gods in order to get a favorable wind, in order to be transported to Troy. And so Clytemnestra never forgave Agamemnon for that. So after the Trojan War, after fighting for 10 years, Clytemnestra didn't forget what Agamemnon had done, so as soon as he gets home, she and her boyfriend Aegisthus kill him to get back at him for sacrificing Iphigenia, despite the fact that there was no way the Greeks could have made it to Troy without that having been done, you know, according to the logic of myth. Okay, it's like, oh, come on, really? Yeah, according to the logic of myth. All right, so more paradox for you, right? More paradox for you, because we already pointed out how horrible Achilles is for being so selfish, and he was willing to let the Greeks lose the war because of his own selfish honor. And here we're talking about the wife of the king who had to do what he did in order for the Greeks to be able to make it to Troy in the first place. Okay, so that's just one example of a homecoming story that is very simple. He gets home, he gets killed for what he did to their daughter. And there are a bunch of others. It's called the epic cycle, a collection of epics that are lost to us except in fragmentary form. And then there's the Odyssey. Now, to even begin talking about the Odyssey is a can of worms, all right? Because there is such a great divergence in the opinions of scholars about when it was composed, and that question bears a lot upon kind of archaeological questions. The idea that there were so many things that occurred in real life around the time when, according to those who argue that the Odyssey is relatively late, for it to be a coincidence, okay? And colonization is the big one. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to let you know what the ancient Greeks said, and then give you a little hint about what archaeologists and historians say now. So, The Greeks themselves believed that the Iliad and the Odyssey were pretty much composed around the same time by Homer. Okay, around the same time, to the extent to where the diehards who believe that they were meant to be performed one after another. So talk about attention span. Whereas the very first word of the Iliad is Manon, which means anger. And so it lets you know right away that this is an epic about the anger, the emotion of anger of this one guy. The Odyssey begins with Andra, which is the same case, grammatically speaking, as Manon. In other words, it's the direct object of the verb. So I hit the table. Table would be a direct object. Okay, it takes the action of the verb. It's the same grammar as anger in the Iliad, but Andra means man. Okay, so the beginning of the Odyssey is not, goddess, tell me of the anger of whatever. It's tell me of the man. Okay, the man and all the crap that he went through, right, and all the trials and tribulations that he went through. That's what the Odyssey is about, and so it's interesting that the first word of the Iliad is an emotion, the emotion of anger that has to be transcended, and the very first word of the Odyssey is the man himself. So you're kind of branching out from one emotion of a man to the whole man. Why? Because if you think about what the Odyssey is about, and we're more equipped than most to do so because of what we already looked at. Let's not forget the pre-Homeric heroes we looked at. There's a lot of echoing of these heroes in Odysseus more than in Achilles. Okay, so the Odyssey is really kind of a unique type of narrative, dealing with this one guy overcoming his anger against Agamemnon. Whereas the Odyssey is the forerunner of the idea that we carried, or you carried with you into this class of the hero, this idea of a hero quest, going out on a quest and conquering places or conquering people, overcoming obstacles in order to achieve your goal. Okay, that's Odysseus. Odysseus, at least in the West, because remember we had Gilgamesh in the East, kind of a nice forerunner of Odysseus in that respect. But in the West, Odysseus is definitely the model for this idea of the hero who goes on the hero quest and eventually, spoiler, achieves his goal. Okay? So the question is, what's the big deal about this idea of him getting back home? If you already have the precedent set of Agamemnon getting right home and then getting killed, that sucks, okay? But the point is he got home really quickly, and so did so many other heroes of the Greeks. Why is Odysseus different? Okay? And it all has to do with Odysseus himself. And so it's reflected in the fact that the epic begins with Andra, with man, because it's all about this guy and the complexity of this guy, Odysseus. All right? So after the Trojan War, just like everyone else, he sets out to get home, back to his island of Ithaca. Relatively minor island other than the fact that Odysseus is from it. And he wants to get back home, and he takes his men, all of those kings who went to the Trojan War have their own men, and he gets within eyeshot of Ithaca on his ship, okay? And then his men got too curious, kind of curiosity killed the cat theme, and when Odysseus was sleeping, they opened up a bag of winds that Odysseus was instructed by the holder of winds not to open, and so he was asleep. They opened him up, and then they caused the ship to be dislocated so far away from Ithaca that from that point on, it took 10 years for Odysseus to get back home. Okay, it took a 10-year odyssey, and that's where the English word Odyssey comes from this epic. Okay, and the name Odyssey itself comes from Odysseus. Okay, so you have Odysseus, Odyssey. Okay, so that's the idea. So Odysseus was that close to getting back home, just like Agamemnon got home quickly. But then because of the curiosity of his men, they disobeyed the order of the keeper of the winds. That's what caused them to be blown away so far away from Ithaca that they had to go through 10 years before they could get back to Ithaca. And in that 10 years, that's the period over which Odysseus encountered various obstacles that he had to overcome. And it's kind of interesting that we're talking about mirroring or echoing some of those pre-Homeric heroes. In this case, you definitely think of Heracles, and kind of Theseus by extension, but Heracles more famously with his 12 labors. You could think of Odysseus as having a bunch of labors in his own right. And they're just like Heracles' labors, they're very diverse. There are a lot of different things that Odysseus has to overcome and different aspects of his character that are revealed by him overcoming these various things. Okay? But they're very different than either Heracles' or Theseus's labors or challenges. You remember Heracles, the Nemean lion, probably the most important of them because of the symbolism of him wearing the headdress of the lion, etc. That was more than anything else a test of his strength. And then the Lernaean Hydra was a test of his ingenuity. When you get into Theseus, then you have a whole other thing. Then you have a much larger ethical component. And you have these bullies that Theseus takes care of one after another, giving them a taste of their own medicine. Okay, so what about Odysseus? What it mainly has to do with, in one way or another, is each of the challenges that Odysseus has to overcome reflects, to some extent, the ultimate challenge that he often loses sight of, and that is homecoming itself. Okay, now what does homecoming mean? It's a loaded word, nostos in ancient Greek. Okay, it's a short word, deceptively short, because it has a lot to it. Okay, nostos, what does it mean? It means a return home, but more than that, especially for a king. He needs to return home, but he knows that after 10 years, there's a chance that his wife has remarried because he assumes that she assumes that he's dead, after 10 years of being out away after the Trojan War. She knows the Trojan War ended after 10 years, and now it's 10 years after that. Okay, and that's why it was important to point out the 10-year thing. So you have 10 years of the Trojan War, and then 10 years of Odysseus going through his Odyssey, and then his wife, Penelope's waiting for him, okay? He hopes. He doesn't know. There's no way to know. There's no Facebook. There's no Twitter. There's no networking at all. And so there's no way for him to know. And I kind of make a joke about that, but I kind of don't make a joke about that because that's a giant difference between his world and ours. There's no way, no telephone, all right? There's no post office even, all right? No postal service. So there's no way for Penelope to know that Odysseus is alive, and there's no way for Odysseus to know whether or not Penelope has gotten married. And there's that tension in the Odyssey that distinguishes it from the Iliad. In the Iliad, the tension was primarily the back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Are the Greeks going to win or the Trojans going to win? Kind of like a football game in that respect. Not to denigrate war, but rather to point out that football is based on war. Okay, it's modeled on it structurally. So the idea is, oh man, it looks like the Trojans are about to win. Oh, no. Now it looks like the Greeks are about to win, back and forth, back and forth. That's the tension of the Iliad. Okay? And in order to underscore that tension, to emphasize it, the scenography, the area in which the action of the Iliad takes place is very limited. Okay, it's very limited. You have the Greek camp, you have Troy, and then you have the battlefield between them. And all of the 15,000 plus lines of the Iliad are contained in that area, except for a couple exceptions. A couple times a character will go behind the walls of Troy to visit a family member or whatever. One time it's mentioned that Zeus is on a vacation to Ethiopia, but that's it. Okay, other than that, it's all contained in there. As opposed to the Odyssey, and this is kind of a hint about the reflection of the Odyssey in what was going on in the real world, the scenography is a lot more varied. And so now, obviously, since you're going away from the Trojan War, you're out in the open. You're out in an uncharted land, and you don't know what's going to happen. And so you have this kind of fear of the unknown vibe to the Odyssey. And that is reflected in the types of characters that Odysseus encounters on his Odyssey. So those are the two main categories of types of challenges Odysseus encounters. One is the very challenge to his being faithful to Penelope, not knowing whether or not she's being faithful to him. And so he's tempted by various female figures, especially Calypso, right, and Circe. Those are the two kind of witch figures that seduce him and that cause him to lose track of time. He has affairs with them, and he almost ends up staying with each of them pretty much forever, as long as they will allow him to, okay? And then certain things happen that eventually lead him to realize that he needs to get back on track and get back on the road. Okay, that's one type of challenge that is embodied by these female characters. Don't forget the sirens, right? He has to be tied to the mast of his ship in order not to be tempted to jump off the ship and try to swim to reach them, in which case, because of the turbulence of the water, he would certainly have been drowned. Okay, so you have all of those types of challenges, but then you have this other type of challenge where you have these kind of monster figures, okay? A son of Poseidon is a cyclops, Polyphemus. And they reach this island that is described as being uncivilized and unkempt and unagricultural, okay? So it's described when they get to this island not for what it has, but for what it doesn't have. It's not cultivated the way a place, is when you're dealing with civilization, but rather something else, and they don't know what it is. And they land on this island and they find out that it's inhabited by these giant monsters, the Cyclopes, the one-eyed ones. And so this Polyphemus guy nearly kills all of Odysseus's men and him, but then they come up with an ingenious way to escape. That's one example of a monstrous figure that he encounters that he's challenged by. Another one is Scylla and Charybdis. As they try to cross a certain strait from one landmass to another, there's this monster that nearly kills them all by reaching down and eating them all, and there's a whirlpool that many of them fall into, leaving Odysseus alone and all of his men killed. So those are the two main categories. There's the femme fatales, the female figures that seduce him and that tempt him to get off track and not return home to Penelope. And then there's these monstrous figures that represent events that occurred in the real world. This idea of an overpopulation of Greece and the need for people from the Greek mainland to branch out, spread out, and to explore other places outside of the Greek mainland, different islands especially. And this is a development that historically occurred in the archaic period of Greece, shortly after Homer was singing his epics. We're talking the 700s BC, just like Homer. And so that's what I mean by the fact that the Odyssey reflects real-world events a lot more than the Iliad did, other than the probable fact that there was a Trojan War itself. And so once Odysseus overcomes all of these different challenges, like the labors of Heracles, then his work is really cut out for him, because then when he gets home, in some ways it's the biggest challenge he has of all of them, and that is that his house is overrun by suitors for the hand of Penelope, because they made a deal before he left for the Trojan War between Odysseus and Penelope only. No one else knew. Even Telemachus didn't know. That if he doesn't get back, by the time their kid, who was an infant at the time, starts growing hair on his face, which is about 10 years, so as soon as he starts going through adolescence, then it's time for her to remarry, because that's what a queen has to do. She has to get a king to run the place. So there's that tension, that constant tension, and it is generated much differently than the tension of the Iliad is. Talked about how the tension of the Iliad is generated by what you can see on the battlefield. Greeks and the Trojans fighting back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's right before your eyes, the way when you're a spectator of a football game, using that metaphor again. In the case of the Odyssey, it's different. You don't have all of the action that generates tension right in front of you. What you have is you're focusing at one time on what Odysseus is doing. He's trying to get over all of these obstacles that are in his way to eventually get back to Ithaca. And then, boom, cut to Penelope on Ithaca, and her doing all she can to survive the onslaught of all these suitors, trying to get her to marry them. Well, let's not forget, she's the wife of whom? It makes sense that Penelope, being the wife of the most intelligent of the Greek heroes, Odysseus, that's what he's best known for. If Achilles is by far the best warrior of the Greeks, he's by far the most ingenious of the Greek heroes. The Trojan horse, the official end of the Trojan War, is a good example of that. In the movie Troy, you might remember, there was that guy whittling the wood into a horse, and he looked at it and went, oh, whoa, it gives me an idea. That didn't happen in Homer, but it's kind of neat. It's kind of neat how they did that, I guess. So Penelope comes up with her own stratagem in order to delay the ultimate day in which she has to eventually get married to one of these suitors. And the way she does it is what? She announces, okay, I get it. It has to be one of you instead of you hundreds, so I can get rid of the rest of you sons of guns. But what I'm going to do is this. I'm going, and obviously to buy time, to still open up the possibility that Odysseus can get back home. What I'm going to do is I'm going to weave this tapestry, and once I'm done with it, then I'm going to get married to one of you people. So she weaves it and weaves it and weaves it, and it gets to the point where it's almost done, and then she starts unraveling it back to the beginning, and then starts it over again. I mean, it's a really amazing tapestry. She says, it takes a long time, but you guys won't believe when it's done. And so she unravels it and then gets back on it, and then it gets close again and unravels it over and over and over until she's caught doing so, generating even more tension, right? And even more suspense, because now once she's caught doing that, now she has to get married to one of these people, right? And then we know that Odysseus is on his way, but she doesn't know. It's a masterful study in suspense. Lots of different things going on at the same time, and loose ends eventually being tied up in interesting ways. This constant back and forth, masterfully represented in such a way that Odysseus gets closer and closer and closer to home, and then eventually gets there. So there's this, constant tension about, first of all, whether Odysseus will eventually get home, and second of all, what will happen when he gets there. Okay, so it's a different type of suspense that's created in the Odyssey than in the Iliad, and a lot of scholars have made a big deal out of the differences between these epics when it comes to that, the type of tension generated, etc. Another really important character in the Odyssey, Telemachus, is Odysseus' son. And he's the guy that we mentioned, once he starts growing a beard, that's time for Penelope to get married. He goes out looking for Odysseus, and the suitors let him do it because they assume that he's going to end up killed in the process. Now, what does that remind you of? Perseus. Remember? Perseus needed to get out of the way. Acrisius said, hey, man, go get you. I'll forgive you for the thing about, your affront regarding the wedding if you go out and kill Medusa. Ha, ha, ha. Yeah, right. You're really going to kill Medusa. That stuff. Okay, so look for those echoes. As far as other characters that you might run across in the future, Eumaeus is a good name to know. Eumaeus is the male servant of Odysseus who is extremely loyal. And then Eurycleia is the female counterpart to Eumaeus. So Odysseus has an extremely loyal male and female attendant. The reason for that is that once he gets back and he does what he has to do, he needs a little help. He needs more than Telemachus and Penelope to help. He needs some loyal people who work for him, and they end up helping him. So what do they help him do? You have a scene near the end of the Odyssey where, first of all, the only way that Odysseus can eventually defeat the suitors, he can't just show up at the door and say, screw you guys, this is my place. He'll get iced in a second. So what he has to do is figure out what to do in order to be able to conquer the suitors? No. Even though he's the most intelligent, he doesn't come up with the idea that enables him to achieve his goal. Athena, who is with him throughout the whole Odyssey, whereas in the Iliad, gods are all over the place. In the Odyssey, it's mainly Athena, who is on the side of Odysseus throughout, and Poseidon, who is his nemesis, because of what he believes to be Odysseus' hubris, thinking he's all that. Okay, so once you have Odysseus getting close to where he's going to go take on the suitors, he's given the idea by Athena to disguise himself as a beggar in order to go into the household. He gets kind of bullied by the suitors, predictably, but then he kind of scopes around, sees what's going on, slowly but surely comes up with the strategy with Telemachus and Eumaeus and a couple others to take care of the suitors, to kill them. And the way that it's done at the very end is you have this room that they're all locked into. The latches on the doors are locked, one after another, just like the movie Carrie, if you saw it. Okay, Stephen King got that idea from the Odyssey. The idea, if you ever saw Carrie, it's a really good kind of horror flick. The idea of locking everybody in before she got revenge on them all. And there was that really intense scene where she telekinetically made all the latches close. That's kind of what goes on, although not telekinetically, in the Odyssey. And once you have them all locked in there, Odysseus, Telemachus, and a few of his loyal attendants end up killing the suitors, and that's the end of that. And then there's the inevitable reunion between Odysseus and Penelope, which really reveals the Odyssey, after all is said and done, to be a romance. Okay, and the very genre of romance came from the Odyssey unequivocally, certainly not from the Iliad, okay, except for one scene in Book 6 between Hector and Andromache, which is beautiful. But other than that, it really is a love story. There's no other word for it, between Odysseus and Penelope. Let me just segue you into where we're moving to. I told you about how the Odyssey, way more than the Iliad, reflects the real world in which it was told. And I told you that it connects to this idea of colonization. Where we're going next is we're going to move on into the archaic period of Greek history, very beginning of Greek history per se, and we're dealing with the idea of overpopulation on the Greek mainland, the need to branch out, the need to colonize various islands mainly, but sometimes extensions of the mainland. And along with that comes some very interesting and important, culturally, politically, and economically speaking, developments that lead ultimately to democracy. I'm going to just leave you with that general idea, and then we'll flesh it out